Stocks falling at the open today in reaction to President Donald Trump's announcement of tariffs on China, Mexico, and Canada. But the major averages did pair losses after Trump said he would delay tariffs against Mexico by at least a month. For more on the latest market moves, let's welcome in Rob Arnott, Research Affiliates founder and chairman of the board. Rob, it's always good to see you.
Great to see you.
What do we make of this? I mean, it seemed as though and we've talked to a lot of investors who have said, tariffs are only a negotiating tool. They won't actually go into effect. We won't see the worst case scenario effect on the U.S. economy. Is that still sort of the base case of the market?
Well, I think to say we won't see them go into effect is ridiculous. He uses these as a blunt instrument to get his way. And apropos of fentanyl, I mean, we're losing more people every year than we lost in the entirety of the Korean and Vietnam War over the course of 15 years. Every year. And these are our kids. These are our sons and daughters, sisters and brothers. It's horrific. But does he intend to impose tariffs when he doesn't get his way? Of course he does. So the notion that these won't go into effect because it's just a bullying tool is utterly naive. The other thing that I think is interesting is economists do endless studies on what this will do for inflation and whatnot. If it's a blunt instrument negotiating tool, why would you model the impact of tariffs as if they're going to go into effect for the next several years, when they might go into effect for several hours? So I think the whole thing is a lot of it's a tempest in a teapot. The market plunged this morning. Markets are always volatile. Whenever there's news, geopolitical news or geoeconomic news, especially big scale that can affect global trade, the markets are going to get choppy. That's totally normal.
Were you surprised by the market's reaction, though, Rob, in any way? I mean, to your point, volatility, but, Trump campaigned on tariffs. He's a believer in tariffs. If you voted for him, you knew that. Listen, his picks to run Treasury, Scott Bessent, likes tariffs. Howard Lutnick, running Commerce, likes tariffs. So were you surprised by how the market seemed kind of surprised this morning with the Dow? At one point, Rob, was down nearly 700.
Well, the market reaction was based on the supposition that the 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico were going to go into effect immediately and would last God only knows how long. And now it looks like at least the Mexican piece is possibly off the table. So the market did what it does. It plunged on the basis of speculations of the impact of what was perceived as bad news, and it rebounded smartly on the recognition that bad news may not materialize.
So then I guess the question is, what do you do, Rob, if anything, in response to, maybe not the headlines, but the broader story of what the tariff implementation could look like and the effect on the economy and corporate earnings this year?
Well, I'm a huge believer in mean reversion. That is to say, markets go too far and they return. Markets soar too far and they return to earth. They tank too far and then they recover. And the same thing applies to individual stocks. We've seen the AI community soar for the last 2 years at two valuation levels that seem implausible. One of the things that I think is fun is stocks that get kicked out of the S&P or out of the Russell index subsequently tend to do pretty darn well. On average, they beat the S&P or Russell by 28% over the 5 years after they're kicked out. So we're an index company, among other things, and we created a nixed index for companies nixed from the index. I wrote a white paper whimsically entitled "Nixed: The Upside of Getting Dumped." I pointed out that most of us have had the experience of getting dumped at some point in our life. I'm sure you're an exception, but we can learn a few lessons and move on to next phase of life, or we can wallow in self-pity for the rest of our lives. Companies that are kicked out of the index can go on to achieve great failure, or can learn a few lessons and get back into the index. So a lot of companies that get kicked out come back in the next 5 to 10 years. So creating that index was fun. We've also created Fundamental Index, which is well known to many of your viewers. It's 150 billion invested in Fundamental Index that simply asks the question, how big is the business? If a stock soars and its fundamentals don't, it says, thanks for that nice high price. I'm going to whittle it back down. If it tanks and its fundamentals don't, it'll say, thanks for the deep discount, and top it back up. And that's a strategy that has a strong value tilt because you're underweighting growth and overweighting value. But it's relentlessly outperformed the value indexes since we launched the idea 20 years ago.
Rob, a final dynamic I'm just curious to get your thoughts on, the dollar, Rob. Just the impact, the ripple effects of a strong dollar on the markets, Rob.
One of the things that I thought was kind of fascinating was during the run-up to the election, at one point, Trump's threats of tariffs went into high gear, and he was claiming that our trade counterparties will pay the tariffs, much like he was saying that Mexico would pay for the wall. And that was ridiculed because, of course, consumers pay the tariff. But in the aftermath of those pledges to raise tariffs, the dollar suddenly strengthened 5%. So that tacitly means that the tariff is being paid for half by us and half by the trade counterparty. So people tend to look at this stuff simplistically and overlook the fact that there are interconnected forces. Tariffs. I'm a libertarian and I'm a free markets guy, but I don't view modest tariffs, 5 or 10%, as anything more than a speed bump that slows down the market's reaction to relative competitive pricing. If a U.S. industry is uncompetitive and there's no tariffs, it can be put out of business fast. If there's a 5 or 10% tariff, it's put out of business a little slower and has a chance to get its act together. So small tariffs don't really bother me.
Well, and those tariffs the current tariffs aren't really being used for those purposes that you mentioned.
Correct.
At least not these specific ones, although other Trump tariffs have been. Rob, always great to get some time with you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for your time.